The guns that tamed the West. Colt, Remington, Winchester, and more. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forests were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
The western frontier was a dangerous and perilous landscape where the path to survival was stained with blood and tears. As thousands of settlers flooded this untamed land, they brought with them the tools of their culture, including the most important, the gun. The gun enabled man to hunt, kept his enemies at bay, and ultimately it allowed him to tame the West. When a man raised his gun, it was more than just a symbol of status and power. It was real power, the power of life and death. The story of American firearms in the West is the saga of America's migration in the 1800s deep into the unclaimed land. The story might begin in the echo of Daniel Boone's long-barreled flintlock exploding in the grassy hills near Kentucky.
In such dangerous times, the experienced mountaineer is never without his rifle, even in camp. His rifle is his constant friend and protector. Washington Irving.
No matter what a man called it, meat getter, hair saver, or sure shot, his gun could be trusted to get him out of a tight corner against hostile Indians or a charging animal. Though Daniel Boone would not travel to the far west, the epic journeys of explorers like Lewis and Clark revealed to America a breathtaking expanse of beasts and exotic native peoples. It guaranteed further exploration by the fur traders and mountain men.
The first guns which would have been carried west by the mountain men would have been typical Kentucky, Pennsylvania rifles. They were rather long in barrel, they were smaller in caliber, about 40 to 45.
And these things were accurate up to about 200 yards, relatively light, and often works of art, very, very beautiful. And amongst the most extraordinary of objects of decorative art from the 18th and the 19th century are the so-called Kentucky rifles and the successor guns known generally as plains rifles.
These rifles fit the forest. They could hit small game from a distance and provide self-defense from hostile natives. The spark came from a simple flint, and replacement stones could be found lining the riverbeds.
In the hands of somebody who is thoroughly trained and experienced in loading a muzzle-loading rifle, you could probably get about 4 shots a minute. What you would do is pour a measured charge of powder down the barrel, put a piece of cloth, a patch, over the muzzle, place the round ball on that, and then ram it down until it was seated against the powder charge.
The flintlock is so named because there actually is a piece of stone, piece of flint, held in the jaws of the cock. When you withdraw the hammer or the cock to full, and then squeeze the trigger, the sparks are generated that flash into the pan and ignite the main charge.
The flintlock was as simple and elegant as the land it came from. The tool of travelers, fighters, pioneers, and hunters, its echo would be heard as far west as California.
What they found was that there was bigger game out west, like the grizzly bears and the brown bears and far more buffalo. So the reports came back east to the gun makers, many of whom were in places like Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and they were told that they needed bigger guns, more powerful guns.
Philadelphia gunsmiths like J. Henry and neighbor Edward Tryon began supplying the guns that would tame the perilous land ahead. Another such maker was called Hawken.
Of course, the trapper or the mountain man, the fur trader of the 1820s and 30s, the general weapon of choice was the single-shot, half-stock rifle, the type made in St. Louis by the Hawken firm.
Instinctively does a Rocky Mountain trapper, in moments of peril, grasp his trusty rifle. It is his companion and his best and truest friend. With a Hawken rifle in his possession, he feels confident and self-reliant, and does not fear to cope with any odds or encounter any danger. James B. Marsh, 1884.
The Hawken rifle was prized by one Christopher Kit Carson, skilled trapper, pathfinder, renowned Indian fighter, and infantry leader.
There are at least 3 guns associated with Kit Carson that were made by Hawken, and there's the most wonderful story of Carson coming in to see Hawken. Some years before, he had ordered a rifle, and he'd been out on the plains or whatever for many, many years, and he came back into Hawken's shop, and Hawken didn't even recognize him.
Oh, yes, I made several for Kit Carson. One of them he prized very much. Kit gave me an order for a rifle, and I didn't see him again for several years. One day he walked into the shop. I didn't know him, and he asked if I had any rifles. I told him there was one on hand, and that was made for Kit Carson. That's my name, he said, and took the rifle for $25. He would have readily paid twice as much, for all my guns were made to kill at 200 yards. Samuel Hawken, 1882.
These rifles were of rugged proportions and substantial firepower. They could take the pounding of the frontier and were accurate.
You would be foolish to venture out beyond the Mississippi River without a firearm. And indeed, even with one, your life was still in great danger.
Well, with the pioneers, the mountain men, whatever, dealing with the Indians, the main disadvantage with the single-fire gun was that the Indians knew that you were shooting a gun like that, so they waited until you shot, and then they would descend on you with very unfortunate effects.
Quite often the mountain man would carry a sidearm. They were often used, let's say, as a last resort weapon.
You could have a secondary firearm with you, usually a handgun, and they were rare, of course, in the West because of the additional expense and the nuisance of carrying a handgun, since there wasn't a regular holster. You either had to throw it through the sash that held yourself together, or wear it on your horse.
Trappers usually traveled in groups, so if attacked by hostile Indians, they would not empty their single-shot rifles all at once. When Jedediah Smith and his men encountered Mojave Indians in 1827, they had only 5 guns among them. Smith ordered,
"Not more than 3 guns should be fired at a time, and those only when the shot would be certain of killing."
Sidearms, however, offered no guarantee of survival. In 1831, Comanches killed Jedediah Smith on the Cimarron River. The elegant dueling pistols he carried spoke of the need for the faster and more deadly weapons that were to come. The first settlers were drawn west by the prospect of acquiring furs and farmland. But these pioneers were but a handful of those yet to come in search of gold. As the population grew, so did the violence. In a territory where lawmen and judges were hard to find, it's not surprising that names like Colt, Derringer, Smith & Wesson were called on to settle disputes between men in this lawless land. When James Marshall found raw gold 44 miles upstream from Sutter's Fort in 1848, the lure of California's riches would give history the gold rush of 1849. Prospectors, gold seekers, and dreamers migrated westward by Santa Fe and Oregon trails, or by fast clipper ship through the Panama Canal to San Francisco.
People came from everywhere. It wasn't just folks from the eastern United States, but people from Australia, people from China, people from Europe, people from other parts of Asia. Everybody rushed in. Everybody wanted a piece of that golden dream.
These hardy souls risked everything on their journey, but on arrival in the gold fields and boom towns, they were still in danger.
During the gold rush era, personal protection became a matter of absolute necessity, particularly in the mining camps where there was no law and order. The miners who went to California, to Montana, to Denver area, all made sure that they carried some sort of a handgun.
With all of the gold seekers, the individuals who went out with the idea of starting businesses, there also came thieves, murderers, prostitutes, and it really was a very lawless period out in California. And virtually everybody carried a gun or knife for self-defense.
There were military companies, fire companies, brass bands, banks, hotels, theaters, hurdy-gurdy houses, wide open gambling palaces, street fights, murders, riots, a whiskey mill every 15 steps, a dozen breweries, and some talk of building a church. Mark Twain.
The desire to be armed was informed by the fact that people expected to be confronted by the notorious in California. Those who didn't find gold honestly might take it dishonestly, that temptations in gambling halls also might take one's riches away from one. And so people believed they needed to be well armed.
Many got peace of mind from a curious predecessor of the six-shooter revolver, the pepper box.
The pepper box received its name from the fact that its barrels, which are all integral, are drilled out of a common cylinder of metal. And looking at it from the front end, it looked like the front end of a pepper shaker. You could literally shake the pepper out of it, except this would have a lot more spice if it were coming at you.
To aim along the turning barrel and hit the thing aimed at was a feat which was probably never done with a pepper box in the world. It's a cheerful weapon, the pepper box. Sometimes all its 6 barrels would go off at once, and then there was no safe place in all the region about. But behind it, Mark Twain, 1861.
The trade in arms mushroomed out west, and gun shops sprang up to supply firearms and ammunition for a varied clientele of miners, businessmen, and gamblers.
During the gold rush, human greed emerged in the extreme, and it was pretty necessary to have some kind of defense against these predators who were going to try to steal your gold.
Henry Derringer began marketing his pistols about the time of the gold rush, and they were compact. Typically, they were sold in pairs, and they were quite popular. In fact, some duels were even fought with Derringers during the gold rush.
There are instances where somebody would have a pair of pistols, boom, boom, he fires those, he'll drop them, and then he'll pull out, say, his Derringers or whatever else that he might have, and the last resort would be his knife, because that's always loaded.
Back on the Atlantic seaboard, a man whose name was to become emblazoned with the West was engaged in manufacturing a revolutionary weapon.
Sam Colt is really one of the intriguing people in American history. He had an idea as a young man when he went to serve in the Navy in the early 1830s that, of course, ultimately led to that invention of the Colt revolver in the period of about 1834 to 1836.
Do not be afraid of any man, no matter what his size. Just call on me in time of need, and I will equalize.
Equalizer has often been a term used in reference to Colt revolvers of all different models. The old saying was that God created man, Sam Colt made men equal. And I think that equalizer thing suggested that people might gain both courage and advantage if armed with a Colt revolver.
Then the gold rush strike in 1848 was perfect timing for Colt, and his factory, which he set up in Hartford, began to produce firearms by the thousands, tens of thousands, and there was such a ready market in the California gold fields that something that sold in the East for about $25 could sell for $250 to $500.
Colt made a fortune when the gold rush took over in California. He introduced a new revolver in 1848 and another one in 1849. The sales of those revolvers, in conjunction with his military sales, propelled him into the forefront of pistol manufacture in the United States.
My firearms will not endanger your eyesight or brain. They do not stick fast, as do the guns which open like molasses gates or nutcrackers. They leave no burning paper in the barrel after a discharge to blow the next cartridge into your face. They are always worth what they cost. In the far West, much more. Almost a legal tender. Samuel Colt.
California's population swelled during the gold rush from 20,000 to 100,000. And by 1852, a mail route had been established to connect this growing population with its roots and its gunsmiths to the east.
Of course, among those who had a reason to carry a weapon in the West were those who carried the mail and carried valuables and freight and other goods. The Pony Express riders, in that brief 18-month history of the Pony Express, had as their mission to carry mail and to do so quickly, which meant they couldn't carry a lot of weight. Often their armament consisted of a Colt pocket revolver, and that was about all they could afford to carry in order to work efficiently.
Ben Holliday was known as the Stagecoach King and was the founder and the principal owner of the Overland Stage Company. He was somebody who really enjoyed his role and had a special silver-mounted stagecoach built for him, although he suffered the embarrassment himself of being out in the plains, and he was intercepted by highwaymen.
The growing demand for stagecoach travel led to an ever-increasing demand for revolvers like the Smith & Wessons. But there would be more in a stagecoach arsenal.
The preferred self-defense gun for a stagecoach guard would always be a shotgun. It was something that, with a shorter barrel, say 20 inches, was ideal for maneuverability. He didn't want to, after all, accidentally shoot the driver.
There are many examples of guards carrying more than one revolver, shotguns, repeating rifles, weaponry supplied both by the stage companies and freight and express companies, and weaponry that they supplied themselves.
So if it was a bullion shipment or whatever valuable, there would be a man armed with a shotgun, a 12 gauge or 10 gauge, usually with short barrels so that it was very maneuverable. He would likely have one revolver, possibly two. They were not going to just throw their hands up, throw the cash out of the stagecoach and go on. It was their job to fight back. They were not supposed to surrender.
Attracted by rich soils and river valleys, immigrant wagon trains carried pioneers westward in hope of a better life. Their large wheels enabled them to pass through the ruts of mud in the prairie roads. Their firearms increased the chance for survival along the way.
The immigrants who were crossing the plains in the 1840s and 50s, in many cases were family units, so they might take with them in the form of guns anything that they owned prior to leaving the East. Might it be a double-barrel shotgun, it might be a single-shot muzzle-loading rifle. You could probably pick out about a half a dozen that certainly were very significant and played major roles.
The most practical firearms carried by people who were moving west to farm moving west to establish homesteads, were usually shotguns or hunting rifles, and often as not, those were weapons that they may have used for the same purposes in farms that they had left in Ohio or Kentucky.
It was a mix. There was no set type of gun that everybody had. They just had, and often these were guns that were passed down 2 or 3 generations, rifles or muskets that would have belonged to grandfathers or great-grandfathers.
Very often, immigrants moving west to establish homesteads and to farm were moving west with a fear of Indian attack. Whether that was a real fear or not almost didn't matter. Veterans of the Civil War armed with their muskets, or travelers armed with shotguns or rifles, needed those weapons not only to satisfy some sense of security because of that fear, but to use them for hunting as well.
A herd of antelopes was seen this afternoon at comparatively short distance. One old fellow was grazing apart from the herd when Reel crept up on him from behind a little knoll and fired a load of buckshot. Reel, being an excellent shot and armed with a shotgun, brought down the game. Helen Carpenter, Oregon Trail, 1857.
Of course, as immigrants moved west on the Overland and Oregon trails, following down the Santa Fe Trail, very often they were bringing weapons that were more ideally suited to eastern environments. Weapons made in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Ohio, weapons of a lighter caliber, single-shot rifles, for example, that weren't necessarily suited to hunting buffalo or killing grizzly bears. And quickly, the immigrants were learning, with the advice of scouts and other travelers, that the larger caliber rifles, such as the Hawken rifles made in St. Louis, were more appropriate to the Western needs.
Firearm in the American West was a tool for survival in 2 respects. It prevented you from being injured or killed by those who didn't want you there. And secondly, it allowed you to get game that you normally would not be able to carry with you. Fresh meat. It allowed you to cross the plains.
Many people, in fact, in that overland journey were injured or killed by accidental discharge of firearms, more so than were killed in Indian fights or other encounters.
The people crossing the plains in the 1840s and 50s, although it's perhaps hard to believe, were more at risk from their own traveling companions than they were from the Indians. They started out concerned that perhaps an Indian was lurking over every hill or behind every bush. Therefore, they carried their guns readily at hand. One of the most frequent ways in which somebody actually might even shoot themselves would be if they were pulling a percussion rifle or shotgun from a wagon, from a bush, with the muzzle pointing towards them, and the hammer might snag on something just enough to draw it back. Then when it slipped free, struck the percussion cap and set the gun off.
Indeed, many people were exceedingly well armed, carrying a brace of pistols or revolvers, California bowie knives and shoulder arms, to the extent that many were needlessly overarmed.
Our men are well armed. William carries a brace of pistols and a bowie knife. Ain't that blood-curdling? I hope he won't hurt himself. Lucy Cook, Overland Trail, 1852.
Some of the groups were organized quite efficiently as almost in a military style. And these, in some instances, would get together and order, or rather purchase, specific guns.
One of the most well-organized journeys by covered wagon was led to Salt Lake City by Mormon leader Brigham Young.
In the spring of 1847 in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where the Mormons were detained for the winter before their crossing, Brigham Young stated to his people that no man should cross the plains without a firearm.
1 good musket or rifle shall be carried by each male over the age of 12 years. 1 pound of powder, 4 pounds lead. After we start from here, every man must keep his loaded gun in hand or in the wagon, where he can put his hand on it at a moment's warning. Brigham Young, 1847.
Orrin Porter Rockwell, bodyguard to Brigham Young, is said to have killed hundreds with his avenging angel.
This is a Colt Model 1862, referred to as an avenging angel. The reason for this is that it's had the barrel cut off. The Mormons, being missionaries and also very persecuted, needed some kind of defense, but they felt very uncomfortable carrying a large gun on their hip and the Bible in the other hand. So they would cut the barrels off and conceal them and have them for this self-defense.
Guns had evolved past the need for flint. Tiny mass-produced percussion caps now exploded the powder and sent the bullet away to its target. The green prairies in the Northwest offered cowmen a chance to work hard for high profits. They were served by the Colts as well as models like the Smith & Wesson and the Remingtons.
We all carried guns. I remember that each of the 6 men had guns almost exactly alike. We all preferred the Colt single-action 6-shooter, or the Frontier model. These men carried their guns with one empty shell in the cylinder. This was for safety's sake. The gun was always carried with the hammer on the empty shell. Cowboy at the M-Bar Ranch, Wyoming.
The first cowboys were really inspired by the vaqueros in Texas. And as the cattle business became really big, well, it was important to bring these cattle up from places like Texas to the trail drives that took them to Kansas, the railheads, and get the meat back east. These cowboys were therefore riding through areas that were sometimes infested with Indians. They might have to deal with rattlesnakes. They had problems that required that they have some kind of a sidearm. And always the best handgun would be a Colt, and the best long gun would be a repeater like a Winchester.
Sometimes the expression, the gun that won the West, has been given to the Winchester Model 1873 rifle or carbine, or certainly the lever-action Winchester.
In 1851, Colt introduced a new handgun to the West. The previous models, the pocket models, had been 31 caliber. The new gun was his 36 caliber or Navy caliber revolver. This particular gun was exceedingly popular in the West from 1852 approximately to 1872. It was probably the most widely carried handgun by the cowboy in the West, by the military as well. Hundreds of thousands of these were produced in the period from 1851 to 1872.
The nomenclature cowboy 6-shooter used for this gun is as accurate as any because of their preference. However, it was not a cheap gun. It was something that might cost them the equivalent of about 6 or 7 months of pay, but it was worth it, and there are many, many references in cowboy memoirs about how important the gun was and how they preferred the single-action Army Colt.
Such guns could be carried in holsters on the hip, which often got in the way, however, and could just as easily be carried in a saddlebag or in a pommel holster. They also would have accessibility often to a Winchester rifle, for example, or a shotgun.
One of the main competitors for the Colt during the period 1870 through 1890 was the Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolver. Its great advantage was the fact that it could eject its cartridges much, much quicker than the Colt. To eject the Smith & Wesson cartridges, you simply broke it open and the cartridges were automatically extracted.
Revolvers were carried by them to put animals out of their misery if they were injured, sometimes just as a symbol of bravado and status.
Firearms had been introduced to the Native American Indians as early as 1750 by European fur traders. But as more and more white settlers made their way into the frontier, the importance of these high-powered curiosities grew among the natives. They would trade their most prized possessions for guns, to be used as hunting tools and for the advantage they provided in tribal wars. Ironically, the guns themselves became the force used to drive the native peoples from their homeland. Against the onslaught of Western expansion, the Indian was doomed. His traditional weapons, the tomahawk and the bow and arrow, were a poor match for his white opponent's rifles and pistols. The Indian, too, desired firearms.
The firearm was the first item of desire when it came to trade. Among the various implements that he traded for, the gun was the number one thing he wanted. It gave him a very definite advantage in hunting and in warfare with his brother tribes.
When an Indian was looking at a firearm with the possibility of trade or purchase, so many of the Plains Indians especially were a horseback culture. They looked for lightweight firearms. Whenever possible, they looked for a repeating firearm.
Indian guns usually have a quite distinctive character. They did like to decorate them, so you can find several that are with tacks. But one more important features of their firearms is that usually when they got a gun, that's probably going to be the gun that they're going to have for a long, long time.
You'll notice in this particular rifle, it is heavily ornated with brass tacks. This would have been put on by the Native American himself. And this person was able to get quite a few brass tacks, as you can see. Both sides are very heavily set with the brass tack design.
The guns used by Indians are decorated and adapted to reflect their owners' diverse traditions and reverence for this powerful artifact of the white man's culture.
Notice the large bow around the trigger guard. This was so that a mittened hand or mittened finger could get in and use it even in the wintertime. Very typical of all the trade muskets is the brass serpentine design between the two screws that hold the lock.
The brass serpentine, for example, which was a sign of quality on the earlier muzzle-loading rifles, sometimes those serpentines were purchased separately and used as decoration.
The Winchester lever action was a favorite rifle to the Indian on the plains. It reloaded quickly and was a rugged companion.
Fine lever-action Winchesters were frequently given sometimes as gifts of state, but as gifts of commerce to Native American leaders.
The Winchester rifle gave the Indians the advantage of rapidly firing as quickly as the action could be brought into play.
Firearms, especially repeating firearms such as the Winchester, were a great boon to use in battle.
There's been a lot of discussion and argument as to just how well the Indians were armed, particularly at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's defeat. Generally, it seems that most people believe that the Indians were not particularly well armed. More recent discoveries out at the battlefield have tended to change that a little bit to the point where now we believe that the Indians did have a proportionally greater number of good, effective repeating rifles.
Well, probably nobody was more aware of that than Custer and his men themselves, because they could hear the repeating gunfire. These sounds of the shots of different types of guns are very identifiable, and a lever-action 1866 Winchester was definitely present in numbers at that battle.
The whole valley was filled with smoke, and the bullets flew all around us, making a noise like bees. We could hardly hear anything for the noise of the guns. When the guns were firing, the Sioux and Cheyenne and soldiers, one falling one way and one falling another, together with the noise of guns, I shall never forget Chief Two Moons, Cheyenne leader.
Some say an invention by this man, Dr. Richard Gatling, might have changed the outcome for Custer.
The Gatling gun, in effect, was a hand-cranked machine gun. It was certainly the most effective of the early machine guns appearing in the 1860s. It involved a cluster of barrels, and as the crank was turned, the barrels rotated in a circle and fired one after the other.
They came in various calibers from as small as 30 caliber on up to 1 inch. They were very effective and could have a firing rate of as much as about 500 to 600 rounds in a minute.
But the Gatling guns were relatively cumbersome. If you're ever out in that part of the country, you'll see that the area over which Custer's force moved is quite broken. Ravines, hills, and so forth. It definitely would have slowed him down.
The gun was not going to be very effective, at least that's the way Custer looked at it, because he couldn't move fast enough. And so he left 3 Gatling guns behind And who knows what might have happened had those guns been at the Little Bighorn.
Although direct confrontation between whites and Indians were frequent, there was a more subtle means to undermine the Plains Indian: elimination of the buffalo.
In my estimation, if indeed there was a gun that won the West, it was the buffalo gun. The single-shot Sharps rifle, in some cases the Remington single-shot buffalo guns.
I used a big 50 caliber Sharps rifle. It shot 150 grains of powder, and the bullets were 1.25 inches long. When one of these big leads would hit a buffalo, whether it hit the right place or not, it'd make him sick, and it wouldn't be long before I put another into him. George W. Brown, Kansas.
The gun which was more responsible in the hands of the professional hunters during this period than any other was the Sharps single-shot metallic cartridge sporting rifle. In approximately 15 years, herds which had numbered literally in the millions of animals have been reduced to a population of fewer than 1,000.
Buffalo hunters moving into Dodge City could stop at the firm of Zimmerman and Company and purchase a fine Sharps rifle. Rifles that might be shot all day, killing hundreds of animals. Rifles that might become so hot that water had to be poured down the barrel.
The Sharps rifle, interestingly, because it was such a long-range rifle, the Indians had an interesting name for it. They called it the shoot today, kill tomorrow gun.
These large caliber rifles, accurate at extreme ranges of 1 mile or more, capable of killing buffalo in great numbers. Such rifles were indeed tools of destruction, and they were very effective.
Wasteful as it was, the tremendous slaughter of the buffalo or bison herds, the 1870s, early 1880s, did have the effect of driving the Indians onto the reservations because their means of subsistence was destroyed.
Despite the fact that the Indians were armed and determined, basically you're facing a situation of a more powerful, advanced technological society over a primitive society. The Indians were literally thrown from the Stone Age to the Industrial Age in a period of less than 100 years.
Six-gun dexterity was required of the peace officer, and law enforcement in the West was underscored by the bark of Colt revolvers.
This is the Colt Model 1873 Frontier or Peacemaker. This gun is considered by many historians to be the most popular gun in American history of the West. It's a .45 caliber piece, 6 shots, used by just about everyone from lawmen to cowboy to criminal.
William Bat Masterson is remembered as one of the fastest gunfighters in bloody Dodge City. He bought his first six-shooter at the age of 17 and took it west by locomotive.
Gents, you will please make and send here to my address, COD, one of your short .45 caliber pistols, nickel-plated. Make it very easy on trigger and make front sight marker high and thick. Send as soon as possible. Truly yours, Bat Masterson, Dodge City, Kansas.
The newest guns loaded from the back and were called breech loaders. Their bullets were self-contained and could be reloaded in seconds. It was William Alonzo Hickok, according to the family Bible, but among gunfighters, he was known by a different name.
Wild Bill Hickok is generally considered the prince of pistoliers, and there are a number of different types of guns that he used, but the Navy Colts were what he preferred.
Billy the Kid, of course, is one of many frontier characters who were associated with Colt and other weapons in the frontier.
He was only 21 when he was killed. He supposedly had killed 21 men at that time. And he, like most people who relied on guns, owned quite a number of them. There's one frequently seen photograph of him in which he's holding a 1866 Winchester lever-action carbine. He is supposed to have carried a Colt double-action Lightning revolver because its small grip fit his small hand quite well. Yet, evidence is very strong that he liked a Colt single-action every bit as much as he did double-action.
It wasn't just men who kept guns in the West. The women, too, were armed and dangerous.
Some of the women on the frontier even became outlaws. Belle Starr is certainly one that comes to mind.
Of course, Belle Starr was often well armed with a Colt single action or Smith & Wesson.
Calamity Jane was, even though not an outlaw, was certainly a rough and tumble one of the boys, so to speak. Women on the frontier were in a pretty hazardous situation because often they were in isolated localities. Their menfolk might be gone for days at a time, and generally they had to know how to handle a firearm.
Small caliber and smaller revolvers and pistols, such as Colt manufactured, were popularly carried by ladies.
They certainly weren't the prime users of firearms. A great many of them knew exactly how to do it. They were courageous. And when you get to people like the Annie Oakleys, they really became predominant characters in the whole panorama of the West.
It was marksmanship that brought stardom to the peerless lady wingshot Annie Oakley.
She began simply as probably as a wing shooter, they were called. Targets were thrown in the air and she shot them. To make it exciting, multiple targets would be thrown and 2 or more shotguns would be used to break the targets. And in the arena, she shot using mirrors, she shot using more than one gun, she shot using a variety of calibers. Everything was genuine. Annie Oakley was, as she said, the first white woman to travel with the Wild West show. Buffalo Bill's was the first Wild West show, so she was the first.
The role of the gun in the West was a theme which would play out in the arenas across America and the world. It was focus on the gun that defined the image of the hunter-turned-superstar Buffalo Bill Cody. Buffalo Bill's Wild West ran for nearly 10 years as enthralled spectators watched the hunts, the fights, and the firearms that had tamed the land west of the Mississippi.
Whether the gun was in the hands of the immigrant who used it to provide food for the table, whether it was in a lawman's holster, a shotgun in the hands of a stagecoach guard guarding a shipment of gold on a Wells Fargo stagecoach in the gold rush country. Without the gun as a tool, the settlement of the West would have been a much more difficult accomplishment.
Keeping peace in the town or the city, it's the Colt single action again, and it's the Winchester. The cowboy and the rancher and confronting the problems that he had, well, again, it's the Winchester and the Colt single action. If it's the gambler trying to tame whatever he wanted to tame, they, of course, preferred the little guns, the Derringers, and hideaway weaponry. And you consider the Wells Fargo, their taming was, their favorite of all their firearms was the shotgun, which was the greatest tamer of them all.
Of course, it's easy to romanticize weapons of the 19th century West. But they were, of course, tools, and for the people who used them, they were important tools. It might mean survival if you needed food, or defense if you were confronted by an attacker, be it animal or human. They were tools that were relied upon, tools that were cherished, and tools that were often as not passed on to another generation.
As men and women pushed toward the sunset, they discovered a hostile land that would resist their advances. And though the West was eventually conquered by these brave, independent people, if they could speak to us now, some with regret, others with pride, they would tell us that their task would not have been accomplished without the weapons they brought with them. that ultimately it was their guns that tamed the West.